Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Caroline Hernandez. I am at the Energy Resources Center at the University of Illinois, Chicago. We facilitate the Rights of Way Habitat Working Group, which provides a forum for energy companies and transportation agencies to exchange information and develop best management practices that promote habitat on working landscapes such as utility and transportation rights of way. We are excited to host this webinar series on the ins and outs of implementing habitat on energy and transportation lands. Today's webinar is the second in the series, and we will dive into the details on enhancing existing vegetation to promote pollinator habitat on rights of way. We have several other webinars planned for the series, including monitoring habitat on rights of way using the newly developed pollinator habitat scorecard on August 13th. Check out the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group calendar for more details. There, we also post relevant news, best management practices, planning tools, and other resources in addition to general information about the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group, upcoming events, working group tools, and past meeting proceedings. In a few days, there will also be a link to a recording of this webinar along with recordings of all past webinars. I want to briefly mention that our next working group meeting will be held in conjunction with the Trees and Utilities Conference on September 9th and 10th in Cincinnati, Ohio. We will be featuring a variety of industry updates and technical presentations with a focus on green contracting to help advance habitat initiatives on the rights of way. We will also have working sessions and networking opportunities. For more information, you can visit our website. As far as logistics for today, everyone is on mute except for myself and the presenters. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat box in GoToWebinar and we will respond as best as we can. If you have any questions for the presenters related to the content of today's webinar, type those into the chat box as well. We have built in some time at the end of the presentation for questions, but please submit them at any time during the webinar. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we will post a recording of this webinar to the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group website over the next week or so. So with that, let's turn to our topic today. We are excited to have a breadth and depth of habitat management expertise represented on today's webinar. Pete Berthelsen from the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund, Clair Ryan from the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, and Chuck Caverly from the Native Landscape Solutions will each share their knowledge and experience on a variety of habitat management topics, ranging from setting management goals, dealing with invasive species, and best practices to increase your pollinator habitat. Then we will have an opportunity for Q&A based on questions you submit during the webinar. Before I turn things over to our speakers, let me provide a few quick introductions. Pete Berthelsen is the Partnership Director for the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund and provides consulting services for wildlife and pollinator habitat needs through the Conservation Blueprint, LLC. Pete has also been employed with Pheasants Forever for over 10 years, working as the Director of Habitat Partnerships, a Senior Field Coordinator, and the Director of Conservation Programs, to name a few. The Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund establishes high-quality pollinator habitats to ensure honeybee and monarch butterfly populations thrive by working with landowners, conservationists, scientists, and beekeepers to precisely target pollinators' needs. Clair Ryan is the Midwest Invasive Plant Network's full-time coordinator. MIPN is a nonprofit invasive plant council that covers an 8-state, 1-province region. MIPN's offices are at the Morton Arboretum, 25 miles southwest of Chicago. Claire began this role in December of 2016. Prior to joining MIPN, Claire worked on interstate water quality programs in the eastern U.S., including the Lake Champlain Basin Program and Long Island Sound Study. This experience allowed her to specialize in the engagement of diverse stakeholders on a regional scale to develop solutions to challenging environmental problems, and she put these skills to further use with MIPN. Claire holds MS, ES, and an MPA degrees from Indiana University, Bloomington, and a BS from Cornell University, all focused on environmental management. Chuck Caverly is the account manager and botanist for Native Landscape Solutions. Chuck has been employed in the green industry for over 35 years and has worked with commercial and residential grounds maintenance, residential and commercial landscape design build, and native prairie restoration projects. Native Landscape Solutions is an ecological restoration company filling a unique niche in the state of Missouri, providing non-native invasive plant control, prairie restoration and stewardship, and stormwater basin installation and stewardship. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Pete Berthelsen to start us off.
Thank you, Caroline. And welcome everybody to the call today. I'm looking forward to this webinar because this is such an interesting area to work with, and it has so many different opportunities. I'm going to be speaking today representing the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund, and very briefly, if you've never heard of that before, check it out because it can be an opportunity to receive free pollinator seed mixtures for some of your different projects that you might be working on and we're talking about today. I want to start this conversation talking about habitat and pollinators in particular with just a couple of philosophies that at least I come to this with. And the first one is that when we're talking about things like monarch butterflies and the potential ESA listing and the different ramifications that that can have, I believe firmly that if we're trying to solve those issues, those monarch butterfly population recovery issues, using the exact same tools that we've been using for the last couple of decades, we will probably fail. We need to be looking at doing things differently. And this is an example of where I think working with right-of-way opportunities is so exciting and something that can be really impactful. Another kind of foundational philosophy that I have and the things that I'll be saying is that not all pollinator habitat is created equal. And some of the different things that Claire and Chuck will be talking about in more detail later in this webinar will provide some information about how to really maximize the benefits that you're going to get from your pollinator habitat projects. So, pollinator habitat. When you say the words pollinator habitat, this is probably what most people have in their mind, an image like this that has all these gorgeous flowering things and is probably representative of the calendar that's in your office when you flip to the month of July and you see this great flowering meadow. And I think this is really important to talk about because one of the absolute most important things that we can talk about related to a habitat project is sitting down and thinking about what your objectives are before you start. If you are listening to this webinar today and you're representing a corporate project, say a company that has gas pipelines in the country, or you're working on a solar array project, there are lots and lots of different people that are involved in this discussion in the decision-making process in your organization. Many of them, when they hear pollinator habitat, are going to think of that gorgeous photo that we just showed, and we want to really set the expectations, determine what your project objectives are before you do a single thing. So I believe that this is one of the most important things to think about what you want before you start. Because when I think about the right-of-way industry, I see huge opportunity. When I see this gas pipeline, I see miles and miles and miles of potential pollinator habitat that can connect great things. I see things that a corporation could market and promote as a pollinator highway. When I see a solar project that's going in, I see the opportunity to reduce future O&M costs, meet all your permitting requirements, your stormwater regulation requirements by including pollinator habitat that's in there. And obviously roadsides are something that has tens of hundreds of thousands of miles of potential opportunity to provide great pollinator benefits that are out there. So there's a huge opportunity to be impactful. And when we think about big issues like Let's just use the eastern monarch butterfly population recovery as an example. I'm sure most of us have probably seen this graph of monarch butterfly population numbers that go up and down. It's a really important issue. It's something that the public is interested in and wants to be engaged in, but it's a big, hairy, audacious problem to try and figure out. Well, a wise man once told me that when you want to try and eat an elephant, the best way to do it is one bite at a time. I believe that right-of-way projects have the opportunity to be really impactful and helpful to an issue like eastern monarch butterfly population recovery, and that those different right-of-way options can be really impactful and something that we should be excited about and chat about. So the first thing that we want to do in determining our factors is really kind of think about what our existing site conditions are going to be, what our objectives of the project are going to be, and then the most important thing in a project that we're kind of planting is site preparation. You're going to hear in far more detail about that later on in the presentation. But then I'm also going to provide a perspective that what you get in terms of outcomes will be very different whether we're talking about new construction in a capital project or managing the existing vegetation. Both of those can be very highly impactful. But then there's other factors that you want to think about. How are you going to plant it? How are you going to manage it in the future? What kind of soil do you have? What's your budget for the project? Where are you located in the country? These are all part of the many factors that should be thought about before you take the first step of going down the path of doing your habitat project. I'll conclude my section of this by saying that if you're interested in some of those more detailed conversations about factors and how to design seed mixtures and how to plant and how to manage, there are additional resources out there. There are several very detailed webinars that you would be able to view by going to conservationblueprint.com. And with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague Claire to begin to talk about evaluating existing vegetation.
Great. Thank you so much, Pete, and hello, everybody. So in order to manage any invasive plants that you might have on a site and to foster existing beneficial plants, you have to figure out what species you have at your site first, approximately how big the populations are, and how they're distributed throughout the site. So you would get that information by conducting a survey of your existing plant community. There are a few different methods you can use to do a plant survey. You can use quadrats of a predetermined size, and those can be chosen randomly, or you can select them based on the site characteristics to be purposefully representative of the whole site. Either way, you want to make sure that you're capturing quadrats that are at different setback distances from your utility infrastructure to make sure you're getting the whole picture. Another method you could use is called a meandering survey, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. A botanist kind of wanders the site and identifies all the plant species that they see until they believe they have a good representative survey. Of course, the person surveying needs to be able to accurately identify all these plants to the species level, and it can also be helpful for them to estimate the percent cover for the most dominant species. To understand the quality of the plant community, it may help to look up locally relevant C values, which can often be found in a local flora. So a C value stands for coefficient of conservatism. It has nothing to do with politics. Rather, it's a ranking on a scale of 1 to 10 of how dependent a species is on the availability of specific high-quality habitat. So a plant that would score a 10, a C value of 10, would be a native species that really probably only grows in one very undisturbed habitat type. So your state endangered species are typically going to be 10s, and you probably won't be finding many of those on a right-of-way. A species that would be a 1 on the other side of the scale is also a native species, but it's very weedy. It's a species that's going to grow just about anywhere. And for the purposes of this, invasives get a C value of 0. And what this can help you do is once you have your total inventory, you can take a mean C value as a relatively quick way to characterize the health of the plant community at the site. And that really helps you get an idea of what you're dealing with, and it can help you compare sites too if you're still in the selection process. There's some research happening now that's pretty exciting about how to use Google Street View and artificial intelligence to identify certain invasive species on road right-of-ways. That might be very helpful in the future. It's just something to be aware of, but it's not quite there yet in terms of the technology. So beyond what you actually see growing, a site can also be characterized by what's in the seed bank. If time and resources are available, it can also be really helpful to take some soil samples and grow out the seeds in a greenhouse in a controlled environment. It'll allow you to identify any species in the seed bank that are not currently expressed in the plant community and to know what you might be dealing with in the future. Right here. Okay, so before we get any further on the invasive plant issue, I just want to make sure we're operating from a common definition. It's a 2-part definition. Invasive plants are non-native to the location being considered, and they are harmful in some way or potentially harmful to the environment, the economy, or human health, or potentially even all three. And in the photos here, I've included some plants that demonstrate these issues in a pollinator right-of-way context. The plant on the right of the slide is particularly harmful to pollinator restoration goals. It's black swallowwort, or Cynanthum louisiae, which is basically milkweed's evil cousin. It attracts many species of butterflies to lay their eggs, but the sap of the plant is acutely toxic to caterpillars. So that's something you absolutely do not want on a right-of-way restoration projects. Certain invasive plants are actually harmful to the right-of-way infrastructure. You can see on the left, you've got some common reed Phragmites growing actually through the concrete of a road or the asphalt of a road and clogging a storm drain. That's certainly a problem. In utility right-of-ways, you might have similar problems with trees where the roots can infiltrate pipelines, or if they grow very tall, they can, of course, entangle power lines and that kind of thing. Then with human health, there are, of course, a few plants that are poisonous to people, either through ingestion or skin contact. The plant in the middle photo is wild parsnip, Pastinaca sativa. It's phytophototoxic, which means the sap, when it gets on the skin, reacts with sunlight and causes nasty burns. So once you know what plants you're dealing with on a right-of-way site, how do you translate that into a prioritized management plan? Probably the first step is to figure out if you have any state-regulated noxious weeds on your site and to understand what your responsibilities are to treat those under the law. I have a whole slide on this issue coming up in just a minute because I know this is a really important issue for right-of-way managers. You also want to figure out if your site has any early detection species. So the graphic on this slide is a typical invasive species growth curve. The x-axis is time, and both the area invaded and the cost of management are on the y-axis. The theory here is that when invasive plant seeds arrive and germinate at a site, the population is low, at least for a little while. If you actually notice the plant at that early introduction stage, you can control it relatively easily and cheaply, and you may have stand a good chance of actually being able to eradicate it at the site. However, as time goes on, the population can grow very, very rapidly. Keep in mind that some invasive plants at maturity produce hundreds of thousands of seeds per individual per year. That's one of the things that helps them expand populations so quickly. And once the site isn't completely invaded, local eradication may not be possible at all, and the cost of continual management will be very high. So if you have an aggressive invasive species at the site that hasn't established a large population yet, you definitely want to prioritize those for control and management. So after your regulated noxious weeds and any early detection species, you would also want to prioritize species that most threaten your site objectives. This might be the most aggressive species that compete most effectively against pollinator beneficial plants, and it should certainly include anything that's acutely poisonous to pollinators, like that swallowwort I showed on the last slide. On the flip side, you may want to put a lower priority on invasive species that provide some pollinator benefits, because those two things aren't necessarily always correlated. In the Midwest, we have issues with yellow and white sweet clovers. They tend to invade disturbed prairie sites, and they can definitely compete against and outcompete natives, but at the same time, they are very good nectar plants for pollinators. So it's not, if you have those on a right-of-way site, it's not that you wouldn't want to control them eventually. It's just that they might be somewhat lower priority until you get a handle on other things. Then you use your inventory, the last step, to get a better understanding of the life cycles of the invasive plants on the site, and use that knowledge to plan control strategies. And I'll be talking about that a little bit later. So just a quick word about those noxious weed regulations. At the end of the day, the bottom line for any site manager is you have to know what species are regulated in your state and what your obligations are under the law to treat those species. But I just want to take kind of a step back and look at some things I've noticed about these laws since I started working for MIFIN. So pretty much every state has a noxious weed law. And most have had one for a long time, often over 100 years. Some of these older laws, they haven't necessarily been updated in the last few decades. So I've kind of termed those ones that haven't been updated antiquated weed laws. They tend to focus on agricultural weeds that have cost and continue to cost farmers a lot of money, and on plants that are acutely poisonous to people and livestock. Unfortunately, they also tend to target species that are already on the far right side of that invasion curve that I just showed you. They're already everywhere, and the best you can hope for is kind of spending a lot of money in perpetuity to keep the population somewhat in check. Now, some states have modernized their noxious weed laws, and these might all look a little bit different, but what you tend to see is a tiered structure where many of the most stringently regulated species are actually on the left side of the invasion curve. They're either not in the state at all yet, but are at high risk of entering, or they're pretty rare in the state. Sometimes a modern noxious weed law is also used to prohibit the sale or transport of invasive plants that are still part of the nursery trade as ornamentals. If the noxious weed law in your state is antiquated, it may be worth starting a conversation with the Department of Ag about modernization to kind of refocus on some of those early detection species and maybe less so on plants that just require treatment forever. So I'm going to be back in a few minutes to talk about specific management strategies for invasive plants, but for the moment, I'm going to hand it over to Chuck, who's going to start our discussion of management tools.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking a little time in this busy summer schedule to join us for this webinar. So when we talk about right-of-ways and management of right-of-ways, we often talk about it as which tools are in the toolbox that you should use. So all sites are different and will dictate the tool choice. And so knowing what type of spraying equipment, what kind of mowing equipment, all depends on what you're trying to do, what your goals are, and the species, as Claire has so well defined. After you've done your species homework, you know what you're tracking for. So assessing each site for work to be done, the access to the site, is it behind the guardrail? Is it easy to get to? Do you have to have permission to get on the site? The types of slopes and grades that need to be negotiated. Can you use a big batwing mower, or do you have to use some type of hillside piece of equipment or a sickle bar? And then overall, what's your goal for that right-of-way? Where are you headed, in what direction? So additional considerations might be time allotted for the work, and so how that functions in the rest of your requirements that you're taking care of on right-of-ways. Also, the personnel available. Do you have summer help? Is there a natural downtime in your regular routine where right-of-way management for invasives and improvement for plant material presents itself? And then, of course, the predictable one, which is weather, right? We all have a great handle on weather. So as we talk about management tools, my favorite question is, how big is the toolbox? So if the goal is to manage the existing right-of-way, one way that we look at it up front is specifically managing the existing seed load. So if we understand the species of plants that are in front of us that we need to control or support, we can time our work in the right-of-way in a couple of different ways. One of the ways would be to look at the mowing ahead of flower period, and Claire will talk a little bit about this later, but timing of mowing and whatnot is really key. The existing seed load could be desirables as well as non-native invasive species, so it might be helpful to know how you time your seed collection in the fall, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. If you don't start, you'll never get a handle on the non-native invasive seed sources, and on Claire's curve you could see the impacts of that. And then conditions may limit the size of your toolbox: budget, location, season, etc. So understanding the benefits and limitations of the tools in your toolbox really increase your ability to successfully manage the right-of-way and achieve the overall goals for the project. So mowing. A lot depends on what type of machinery and equipment you have. A classic brush hog or a batwing mower. There's a new product in the marketplace that's made by Altos. It's a Z-turn that has a heavy-duty brush deck. So that's a tracked unit, which is really fabulous on hillsides. Sickle bar, which has been around forever. And then we attempted to create our own mower, trying to find something that would mow at 6 to 8 inches in height, because most standard commercial equipment doesn't do that. So we created the Frankenmower, which is on your right-hand side, and it was extremely tenuous, extremely dangerous, and not recommended. So the Frankenmower has been retired. Mowing for seed load, though, really means being able to mow at those specific heights, especially if you're doing some establishment of new seeds, and you have a cover crop. Getting that cover crop off like you see in the sickle bar mower to allow that light to get down to the natives and the new establishing natives. And different machines give you different height options. So the taller the deck, the more lay down often is experienced. So depending on how you're mowing, if you've got a 4 to 6 foot tall right-of-way with ragweed or some of the big tall grasses, depending on what you're mowing, like with a sickle bar, it all lays down and can become a long-term issue with all that extra duff. Another great tool in the toolbox is prescribed fire. Often it takes lots of approvals by different agencies, but your results tend to be fantastic. Years ago, the Kansa Prairie out in Kansas did a study where they looked at different tracts that they had. They divided that prairie into different management regimes. And so for the greatest amount of diversity, a fire on a 3-year cycle thereabouts created the highest amount of diversity. It works great for removing all that extra duff. The burn plans are often required, including a certified burn boss and local department participation. I got to tell you, I haven't met a fire department that doesn't like to do a grass fire. They never get enough practice. A unique opportunity to advance the long terms of the goals and to promote the diversity of your right-of-way. The unintended consequences are seed stratification of some species. And for example, we did a project a couple of years ago when we were working with the Corps of Engineers, and 3 years prior to us being on site, they had been told a great way to control Lespedeza, the Serratia Lespedeza, is to burn it. So they burned it. And what they did was basically wake up all the seed in the seed catch and in the soil after that fire stratification. And so the next spring, all of the Lespedeza seed, which, as you know, is a ton, germinated. Well, they didn't do anything for 3 years. So when we showed up on site, the Lespedeza had been going nuts for 3 years, and it literally took a four-wheel drive truck in low gear, almost with my foot to the floor to get through the Lespedeza. It was that thick. Herbicides. Claire's going to talk a little bit more about herbicides, but a lot of it depends on what your project is, what your target is, and understanding your methodologies. So if you're doing seek and treat, where you're being really specific, going after specific invasives or specific issues and problems, like Johnson grass or whatever it might be, that methodology is often slow and laborious versus a broadcast. The drawback, of course, with a broadcast application is you've got a lot of collateral damage. If you've got Lespedeza intermixed with milkweeds and everything else, you're going to have to value which is most important. Weather conditions, as you all know, getting the herbicide to the plant in the proper way and getting it to be rain fast and stick to the plant so your efficacy remains high and your control is key. Also know the label and know the target. The label requirements are what you have to follow, and knowing that your target in the mix, whether that label says high volume, low volume, basal spray, whatever it might be, making sure you're doing it according to the label. And then the other last piece is choosing the equipment. Is it a backpack sprayer? Is it a boom sprayer or a handgun, whatever it might be? The site you see on the right is the guy's using a JD9 gun blasting kudzu. That's the same site as the center photo, which is kudzu taking over the old Highway 67 bridge just outside of Poplar Bluff, Missouri. That was a very very scary site. And then one thing to remember is mist from a 10-foot tall sprayer, the real fine mist, can travel up to 3 miles in a 5-mile-per-hour wind. So something to think about when you're treating right-of-ways. Interseeding. So this is really the art of improving what you have with what you have. In other words, if you've got an existing site and you know you can collect seed from it to help fill in and improve your stand, it's a great way to do it. You can also buy local seed, local eco-type seed, which really are adapted to perform well for you wherever your location is, and those are important as well. Choosing the right equipment, whether it's a no-till drill like you see on the left. That no-till drill, real quick, has 3 seed boxes on it. It has a small seed box because, as you know, some of these natives, the seeds are about the size of grains of salt. It has a fluffy seed box, so think of big grass seeds or dandelion type seeds that have a lot of extra pubescence on them to help them travel in the wind. And then it has a third seed box, which is for the cover crop. So in some cases, you can use that as no-till and go right into a mowed right-of-way to help improve your stand. Broadcast seeding is the second method. That's the photo on the right. That's a Highway 50 right-of-way outside of Jefferson City, Missouri, where we went in and broadcast right into an existing new right-of-way that had been done a couple of years before. But the native grasses that they had planted were still establishing. And so it was really easy to broadcast and get good success. And then, of course, lastly is handwork. How to choose those pieces of equipment are all up to access, the terrain, the size of task. No-till drills hate big rocky soil. Handwork can be laborsome and not get a lot of production per hour or per day. And then the seed to be used. What kind of seed is it? Often when we broadcast, we'll mix like a calcined clay product with the seed to help with distribution. And then the fun thing with interseeding, I think, is begin with the end in mind. So if you're identifying opportunities through the season and you have the ability to go out and collect what's there to improve what you have, it's a great way to do that. So our crews literally in the fall time and then monitor even as the season goes on. We'll be on site providing stewardship services, and we'll collect handfuls of seed and then redistribute it right away into bare spots. On the photo on the left, you see some bare spots that are even within the mix on the right of way. There's always seems to be a bare spot. And so we'll capture seed, and often the results look like the one on the right, where you get surprised a year or 2 years or 3 years down the road. And I think Pete will talk a little bit more about that. And with that, I hand it back over to my esteemed colleague, Claire. Claire?
Great, thank you, Chuck. So I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about managing invasive plant threats on the right-of-way that is being enhanced for pollinators. I'll be honest, it is a big challenge, both for mowing and herbicide use, which are kind of the two most commonly reached for tools in that toolbox. But with careful planning and implementation, it can be done. Let's talk a little bit about mowing first. One huge challenge straight up is that there are certain invasive plants that can reproduce from stem fragments or that root sucker very aggressively in response to any stem damage. And you don't want to mow these species at all if you can possibly avoid it, because you're going to make your problem a lot worse. The photos on this slide show examples of both of these. On the left is a photo of Japanese knotweed, which can reproduce from stem and root fragments. And then on the right is it's a tree, black locust tree, which is native to the greater Appalachian region, but it's becoming invasive in parts of the Midwest. It suckers very, very aggressively from the roots if the main stem is damaged. That's why you see in the picture it's kind of a lateral root with little root suckers sticking up. Tree of heaven is another tree species that's absolutely infamous for behaving this way. So if you have a site with these types of species, these are some of the hardest species to manage. In all honesty, you may want to avoid it entirely for enhancement for pollinator species, but you certainly don't want to start mowing it. A challenge for managing invasive perennials is that the frequency of mowing that will actually reduce the invasive population, i.e. kill individuals, is much greater than the mowing frequency recommended for pollinator habitat. And the ideal mower height for managing invasive perennials is much lower than the pollinator-friendly mower height. So how do you overcome these challenges? Mowing alone, is probably not going to reduce the existing population of invasive perennials. That's when you might need to use some other tools, but mowing can be effective for annuals and biennials. But as Chuck mentioned, the timing is often really, really important. The diagram on the left shows how annual and biennial plants expend root energy over the course of the growing season. It's going to vary a little bit by specific by species. This is kind of a little bit generalized, but overall, annuals and biennials use a lot of energy to produce flowers. So if you mow right after the flower is produced, the window of mowing opportunity at the bottom there, the plants generally won't have enough in reserve to flower again. But if you mow right before flowering, many plants can still have enough in reserve to flower and seed. The photo on the right is wild parsnip again, and this was mowed too early in the season. And it still managed to produce flowers that will seed, and the population will continue to expand on that site. It obviously is pretty short. This plant can produce flowers that are very low to the ground, even though that's not its typical habit. As these plants are wily; they'll do all sorts of things. And of course, the challenge is that you have to integrate the timing for invasive control with the life cycles of your pollinator species and the life cycles of pollinator beneficial plants. One thing to keep in mind is that some perennial pollinator plants, I am thinking specifically of milkweeds here, actually benefit from mowing after the first flowering, as it's the equivalent of deadheading in your garden, and that milkweed will reflower. If you do end up needing to mow during really important periods in pollinator life cycles where there are likely to be caterpillars or chrysalises in residence, it's really important to target mow and spot mow where the weeds are thickest if you possibly can, or to stagger mowing, where you only mow part of the site at a time and you leave some refugia for your pollinator species. Moving to herbicide really quick. As Chuck mentioned, you really need to use targeted methods to get at invasive threats while not damaging the pollinator beneficial species. You want to probably favor spot treatments and equipment that facilitates spot treatments over broadcast wherever you can. Herbicide applicators on pollinator right-of-ways absolutely have to be trained to recognize the invasive species being treated and to tell them apart from any beneficial lookalikes. Some good news, though, on the herbicide front is that you can often use the aggressive phenology of invasive plants to treat them at the very beginning and end of the growing season while minimizing off-target damage. You can spot spray the basal rosettes of biennial species in the early spring or in the early fall. The plant in the photo on the left is the basal rosette of common teasel, which is a major pain on rights-of-ways in the Midwest. You can see that it's nice and green, while there really isn't anything else greened up around it at that springtime photo. Similarly, many invasive woody species tend to lose their leaves late in the fall, enabling treatment after most native species have already senesced. On the right, that's buckthorn in a wooded situation where that's the only thing that's still green. Let's just look really quick at some best practices for choosing an herbicide. You do want to choose selective herbicides where it makes sense based on the target species and the beneficial species you're trying to protect. Herbicides are, of course, sadly not nearly as selective as we actually wish they were, where, you get the calorie pair chemical or the buckthorn chemical that just does that one plant. It's not quite like that, of course, we all know. You definitely also want to pay attention to the soil persistence and activity of herbicides if interseeding will be taking place, or even if you just want the pollinator plants to be able to self-seed into the treatment area. Keep in mind that products with multiple chemicals, so your mixes, should be considered as persistent as the most persistent ingredient. Some herbicides persist for long enough that you wouldn't want to interseed during the same growing season as you're applying these. I've listed a few there. And others can persist much longer, depending on site conditions. I know Chuck would never recommend Imazapyr, for example, in a restoration site because it can persist for over 2 years if the conditions are right. And your beneficial plants just won't grow. There's a larger potential for off-target damage. But at the same time, there are some species that are resistant to a lot of herbicides, and Imazapyr is one of the only ones that tends to work. So it's a huge challenge. You just need to keep these things in mind when making your selection. My last slide here. We do want to just talk about some best practices to avoid spreading any invasive plant seeds. You can strategize with timing your treatment as best as you can, but in reality, managing a right-of-way will pretty much necessitate coming into contact with some weed seeds. If you know that invasive or woody species have got to seed when you're going in to do your management activities, it's extra important. But really, these should be pretty much just basic practices that you're doing every time you have people and equipment on site. So the big mantra here is to arrive at the site clean and leave clean. That means removing all plant material and mud, and keeping in mind that some plant seeds, some invasive plant seeds are very, very tiny. You might not even see them with the naked eye. So this means cleaning all vehicles, equipment, hand tools, including the tires and moving parts, getting the mud out of all those grooves. You also want to make sure that workers are cleaning their attire appropriately, their boots, their clothes. Some invasive species seeds, they're specifically adapted to hitchhike on soft surfaces, so they're just going to stick to you like glue. Some equipment that can help with these objectives: stiff bristle brushes, an air compressor, high-power air compressor, a vacuum, and washing is often not possible on site, but obviously a really important practice between work days, between site visits. All right, so I think we're going back to Pete for our last few slides to wrap up, and then we'll be taking questions.
All right, thank you, Claire. I just wanted to kind of do the summary of what Chuck and Claire had to say and kind of circle back to what I started with. Not all pollinator habitat is created equal, and really one of the most important things that you need to do on the front end of thinking about how you're going to incorporate pollinator habitat into your either existing or new construction is to determine what your objectives are first. Because if the objectives that you have as a site manager are not what somebody higher up the corporate line thinks when you say the words pollinator habitat, that can put you in a position where somewhere down the line, 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, somebody is disappointed and says, well, that's not what I thought pollinator habitat was going to look like. So those issues can really be addressed by really critically thinking about what your pollinator habitat expectations are. So one of the expectations that I think this panel of presenters wanted to kind of relay to you is that where a new pollinator habitat project is being established, you should operate with the philosophy that in the first year, the year of installment, that habitat project will probably what we call sleep. You might look at it and not see lots of things that are going to happen. In the second year, that project tends to creep. The annuals and the biennials in your project are probably very evident, but perhaps some of the perennial plants really haven't started to come on yet, and you're wondering what this effort is producing. Is it going to produce the kind of results that people further up the corporate ladder are going to want? Well, one of the basic philosophies that we have is that in year 1 it sleeps, in year 2 it creeps, and in year 3, with proper establishment and management, that project leaps. And that is when the annuals, the biennials, the perennials have all kind of come to fruition, and that project is moving along and is in a much better position to be looked at and viewed as a functioning pollinator habitat project. So setting expectations of what your project will look like is probably just as important as sitting down and thinking about what the different factors are and that sort of thing. And that issue is probably even more important when we're talking about something in a corporate structure setting. I wanted to conclude by saying that when you're working with existing vegetation and you're working to manage an area, what you get for pollinator habitat value and pollinator habitat response might be very different than something that is a new construction or a new project. When you're working with a new construction or a capital project that's coming on, it's probably a little bit easier with the proper site preparation to get to this project that looks more like the photo on the calendar in the office for the month of July that I talked about. So that's also part of setting expectations. Both types of projects, existing vegetation and new construction, can produce significant positive pollinator results, but what those results look like, how quickly they come, what form of management they want, what the budget is, all of those are factors that will be different depending on what kind of a project it is that you're working on. And I guess the last slide that I have before we turn it over to Caroline is that all of these projects, all of these right-of-way projects can be very additive and impactful to pollinator habitat and pollinator health. There are tremendous opportunities out there to develop what I referred to at the start as a pollinator highway, habitat that connects isolated different pollinator habitat areas that provide significant value, especially for things like the eastern monarch butterfly population. And as that species is under consideration for an Endangered Species Act listing, it's a pretty darn critical and important species to be thinking about. So on behalf of Claire and Chuck, we're going to be happy to take questions that might have been passed along that Caroline will be asking us, but we appreciate the time and energy and attention you gave us today and for getting on the call. And we hope that if you have additional questions, you'll jot down our email addresses here, and please feel free to reach out to us to follow up after this webinar. So Caroline, back to you.
Thank you, Pete. We do have a couple questions already, and I want to encourage everybody that if you have questions, to please type them into your chat box, and we will address them as they come in. Our first question is, we often allow Kentucky bluegrass to grow long without mowing schedules. Is this known to be still beneficial for pollinators with wildflower plantings, or is native grass seeding a best practice? You might all be muted.
I'm sure we were all muted. Pete, do you want to jump in on that?
I was waiting, Chuck. I was waiting for you to take that one.
Well, I guess my perspective is, right-of-ways for us in Missouri, bluegrass tends to be not much of a presence because it doesn't like the summer drought and summer heat. It's also extremely susceptible to the high humidity, so we don't have a lot of fungus. It's susceptible to a lot of fungus issues as well. So in Missouri, we see it very little. I think there's nothing wrong with a long bluegrass left long and left to go to flower. I can't really speak to its importance for habitat for pollinators.
Thanks, Chuck. Pete, did you want to add anything onto that?
Well, I will just add that from the perspective of a wildlife biologist and a pollinator biologist, Kentucky bluegrass is a little bit of a frustrating species because it is so dominant and it's hard to control. As biologists, we often talk about our frustrations with brome and fescue as invasive cool season grasses. I tend to find Kentucky bluegrass to be even worse because it's harder to control with a herbicide than those two. So I understand its value for providing grass cover, like lawns and things that can be maintained easily with mowing, but it doesn't work and play well with something that we would want to have an abundance of forbs for pollinator value.
Thank you. All right, Pete, I have another question for you. In order to continue enhancing existing rights-of-way vegetation, do you see a need for additional rights-of-way vegetation management crew training? And if so, what types of training do you see would be beneficial?
Well, I think that there's always something to be learned. So I'm an advocate and in favor of additional training. And when I say training, I don't envision the most valuable part of a training being a respected speaker coming in and telling you what they think. I view it as a respected, evaluated trainer coming in and a two-way discussion of the people in the field and the people in the audience that you're talking to, having a real dialogue back and forth to figure out what works for all the objectives that right-of-way project has. And so obviously a roadside right-of-way has an entirely different set of objectives to consider and to deal with than a private landowner would have with a project on their property. So it has to be a real give and take back and forth to have the most value in the training. But just the things that we've chatted about today, about what are some of the management techniques? How do you approach evaluating what is great pollinator habitat? How do you do it in a manner that meets all the corporate objectives, the permitting requirements? Those are things that I think there's just a tremendous amount of opportunity to continue a dialogue that produces significant pollinator benefits.
Excellent, thank you.
And Caroline, I would add from a training standpoint, if you talk about a police department, they practice shooting all the time. And so for our crews, when we're going out and we're doing right-of-way treatments, we're identifying and reminding and refreshing what our target species are, and then also helping our crews understand our standards so they're not spraying off target, the desirable plants. So we spend a lot of time identifying not only what our target is, but what our target isn't. And it's one thing when it's got flowers on it. It's a whole nother scenario when there's no flowers and you're just looking at a vegetative mass. So for us, we do it all the time. It's ongoing all the time.
That's helpful. Thank you, Chuck. Our next question is, which method of seeding have you found to be most effective? And I'll leave that open to everybody.
Pete?
Okay. My answer would be is that really depends. Depends on your site preparation, depends on the type of seed mixture you're going to do, what your geography is. But know that the seeding method is really about how you optimize your seed to soil contact. So what that means is if you don't have great opportunities to have the seed touching the soil, you would not want to use broadcast seeding. In that case, you would want to use a drill or one of the other methods that Chuck talked about. So like so many things, the answer is it really depends. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chuck to give his thoughts on it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The photo that I showed along the Highway 50 right away, that highway was brand new, had warm season grasses only sowed 3 years prior. So the amount of bare ground was pretty significant. So I was a little skeptical when all we were authorized to do was to broadcast those miles and miles that we did. But the results 3 years later, MoDOT and the funder couldn't be more pleased. In fact, one of our local seed guys goes to that site every fall and every summer to collect seed because the forbs have taken off and done so well. The other thing is to think about, that duff layer that's in the ground or thatch, how you break that up, whether that's with a cultipacker or an aerator or even a wire harrow turned, a spring harrow turned down to break that duff layer up really makes a difference in that seed's penetration and down into the dirt layer. The other thing I can tell you is if you we did a job a couple of years ago that was a bare dirt job. We came in and drilled it. The specs called for straw to be broadcast over the site, which it was. And then they came in with a cultipactor, and it took all of our seed that we had so carefully placed in the top quarter inch of soil and buried it ½ inch to an inch down. So we're still waiting for some of that seed to germinate.
Thank you. I want to respect everyone's time, but I wanted to squeeze in one more question. And for the rest of the people that have submitted questions, we will work on emailing you answers afterwards. But for Claire, I think this question is geared more towards you. But in established areas that have large amounts of smooth brome, here in Edmonton, we are working under a selective herbicide ban. Do you have suggestions to control grass populations before planting native plant species?
So this is, okay, before planting. I mean, I would say to look at some of those grass-specific herbicides. If you're kind of, if you've got mostly grass species that you are trying to control, I would look for those and do that in the year before, or actually earlier in the season before you seed your desirable species.
Thanks, Claire. So I just wanted to add before we end this that I want to remind everyone that we have an additional webinar on August 13th on how to use the pollinator habitat scorecard. So go to our website and you can find a link to register for that. And then I want to end this webinar with a huge thanks to all of the presenters for working with me to develop the content of it, as well as for presenting and sharing their expertise with a broader audience. I also want to thank all of the attendees. If we did not get a chance to answer your question, like I said before, we will work to follow up with you afterwards with answers. Finally, I will email the registration list once a recording of the webinar has been posted to our website in the next few weeks, and I will send you a link of where to find a recording of it. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a good rest of your Tuesday.